Greetings. My name is Matt Lawson, and you are in the Enhancing Cybersecurity Across the Hybrid Cloud session, sponsored by NetApp. Again, got a real treat for you today. You are going to experience Attack of the Mats. Again, my name is Matt Lawson. I'm a principal architect at NetApp, and later we'll be hearing from Matt Trudwin, a technical security architect at NetApp. But again, we're going to be talking about cybersecurity and issues around cybersecurity facing higher education today. So interestingly, cybersecurity attacks are definitely on the rise. And in 2019, over 1,000 educational institutions were targeted by ransomware attacks. And so, one of the questions we want to ask is, why higher ed? Interestingly enough, the education industry is the second most common attack target for ransomware. One of the reasons for that is that it's a very large attack surface if you think of all the students and faculty and staff. And then, prior to COVID, they were all coming on campus and bringing multiple personal devices, and those personal devices were joining, campus networks and campus data systems. And now, even today, while most students and faculty, a lot of staff are working, learning remotely, teaching remotely, now we're joining remote networks and a whole host of remote devices into our data networks. And so again, there's a very large attack surface in higher education. And traditionally, and this is not a knock against education, but education has had a passion for openness and academic freedom. Oftentimes it's about how can we share our data as opposed to how can we lock it up and protect it. And then also, shadow IT can create multiple unprotected entry points into the campus digital environment. Again, we've always talked about how easy it is to swipe a credit card, and you've got cloud infrastructure that potentially can create shadow, and cloud is not immune from security attacks and ransomware. So not only do we need to think about how do we protect our data that's on premise or on campus, but then how do we protect our campus data that's rightfully in the cloud, or even as we start to rationalize shadow IT, how can we make sure that data is protected as well? And then Matt Trudwin is going to later talk about the different types of ransomware. But in 2019 and in 2020, we're actually seeing an increase of the breach ransomware type of ransomware. And again, Matt will go into detail about that. And then finally, in terms of just introducing the topic, one of the, industry leading reports in terms of breach and ransomware attacks is the Verizon Data Breach Investigations Report. And again, one of the interesting things is I wanted to share specifically about the 2020 report. It calls out education and talks about some of the unique things that they've researched around breaches and attacks in education. Number one that's interesting is that the threat actors for education, at least in terms of this Verizon report, 67% were internal, but the scary number is that 33% of education attacks were internal. A valid, legitimate access was used to do an attack. Now, it could have been a compromised account, but nonetheless, it was still a legitimate account. Another interesting stat from the report is that in education, 92% of the attacks were financially motivated. So again, whether it's financial aid fraud, trying to ransom, to extort money, most of the attacks were to gain some sort of financial benefit. Then finally, again, the report indicates that the most dominant attack method in education is a phishing attempt. So anyway, with that backdrop in terms of helping us better understand the landscape, I want to hand it over to Matt Trudwin, where he can talk and get into a little bit more of the specifics about ransomware and how we can protect ourselves from ransomware on our college campuses.
Thanks, Matt, and thanks to everyone joining us. Today I'm going to be talking about ransomware, how it has evolved, and how you can recover from a ransomware attack.
All right, so when you think about ransomware, the first question is, how much does it cost to recover? Are you going to have to rebuild servers or workstations? Are you going to have to pay the ransom? How much downtime are you going to have? And according to the Corvette Consumer Report, $36,295 was the average ransomware payment in Q2 of 2019. And this is just per incident. So if you have multiple incidents, it could be more. And when you think about the actual cost, it's typically 5 to 10 times that. The reason why is downtime. The average ransomware incident lasted 9.5 days. So you can think about that. Typically, that's a factor of 10x. So at a minimum, an incident might cost you $363,000. Different businesses, downtime could impact them more. That could go significantly up depending on how long that business could be down. And one of the things we want to talk about in general is just this is a report about the Verizon releases every year called the Data Breach Investigation Report. This is the 2019 version. They use 2018 data. And some of the things they saw that I want to point out related to ransomware is this thing in the middle right here. So in healthcare, 70% of the malware attacks where ransomware would fall under are actually ransomware based. And also 26% overall included malware. We see a lot of botnet infections. Botnet infections are when someone controls many different computers and they could infect them across the globe and use them to target a particular system. Ransomware would actually show up in this incidents report, not a breach. Typically, breach requires confirmation of data loss. And in ransomware, actually, most of the time, they do get the data back. I think it's over 90% of the time they do pay the ransom back. But there's a cost, obviously, associated with it and amount of time before they get the data. And then what's the motivation behind ransomware? Well, you can think 71% is financially motivated, and it takes months to discover. So we're going to talk a little bit later about strategies for ransomware in particular, but one of the things is you want to think about your backup strategy. And if you're not going to discover they're in your environment for months, that definitely needs to come into play, how long you retain those backups. Okay, another report we like to look at for trending. So this came from the Symantec Internet Security Threat Report. And ransomware overall is actually down. It's down 20% year over year. Why is that? Well, actually, that's with consumers. They're using email. Email is the main delivery system for ransomware. And so consumers are using a lot more social media apps now. They're not using as much email as they used to. However, note that ransomware is actually up in the enterprise. It's up 12%. Enterprise is still very email heavy. Okay, I know at NetApp, we get a lot of emails at NetApp. And so that's definitely still an attack vector. Also, like I said, it's up, and then mobile ransomware you see is actually up 33%, attack on mobile phones, that type of thing. So even though the trend overall is down, it's really not going anywhere in the enterprise space. Okay, so how did ransomware kind of evolve? How did it start out? And what are the types of ransom? So really the first type was just what you can think of as denial of service ransomware. They would use some of those botnet infections I touched on. They would target a specific domain and do kind of like a ping of death. They would take your website offline. And they'd say, hey, pay us, or we can continue to make it inaccessible for you to sell goods on your website. Then we go sort of to the next method of ransomware, and that was actually data breach. And what they say in this case is, hey, we've got your data. We're going to reveal CEO salaries. We're going to reveal trade secrets to the public domain unless you pay us. Okay? That's kind of the next step in ransomware. Take us to today, and what are we seeing now? Rather than spend time to get the data off-site and then threaten to leak it unless you get paid, they are taking your data, keeping it in the same place, right in your own environment, and they are locking it down. They say, all right, your files are still there, and guess what? If you pay us, you'll be able to access them again. Okay, so what really is that third form of ransomware? How does that get in the network? What does that look like today? This is a high-level overview. You got users accessing their documents. Could be from a phone, could be from tablet, PC, what have you. The hacker, he wants to make money. So he creates the ransomware. You see some cases he actually buys it, doesn't create it. He finds a way to get it onto the system. Once it's on the system, then it'll actually take the ransomware executable, and it will go and encrypt all the files that it can find, typically across the network, not just on that local machine. Then he says, okay, if you give me some money, I have a decryption key, which you'll need. And if you pay me, then I'll provide you with the key. In theory, you should be able to unlock your data. Sometimes what actually happened, there was a case where a ransomware could not, they had the decryption key and they couldn't actually decrypt it. The reason why is the ransomware had to be patched, just like the system. And yeah, so once they said, oh, hacker, we gave you your Bitcoin, but and he's like, install this patch. Yeah, even ransomware needs patches. So. All right, so how has it changed? Well, ransomware actually started out in 1989. So at least the first one that we know about. And there was an AIDS conference in '89. If anybody was around during that time, AIDS was a very significant deal. And so people attended this conference. And a guy got a list of all the attendees, and he sent them this floppy disk. It said it had AIDS research data on it, okay? So he sent it to all the attendees. They put the floppy disk on the system, and they couldn't actually access their files. And it said, send money to this P.O. box, and I'll be able to unlock your files. So they were able to find the guy, because I guess he opened the P.O. box in his name or something, but law enforcement did find him, and they shut that down pretty quick. But that was the first time we actually saw ransomware. The big thing I want you to see to highlight is the gap. So we go from 1989 to 2005. That's the first we know of ransomware actually encrypting files. 2010, the way that they actually paid for ransomware, the way they paid the ransom back then was, if any of you guys remember back in 2010, you could still download ringtones for money, and there was a lot of pay for text services, not unlimited everything like there are today. So they'd say, hey, send a premium text, and then we'll unlock your data. 2012, Revton, this was a big one because what it was is it looked like the FBI, and the FBI was coming after you and saying, hey, we're going to put you in prison unless you go ahead and pay us this fine because you did these bad things. So it got so bad that the FBI had to come out and say, hey, look, when we're coming after you, we don't send an email. We send you a letter, or we actually show up at your house. So please stop sending the money. And then when we come out to 2013, we've got CryptoWall here. That's the first one where we know that Bitcoin was actually involved for the payment. All right, so we had a little bit of gaps there. Let's keep going with this now. Yep, 2014, we have some different variations. 2015, we've got Tesla Crypt. 2016, the first time that Mac OS had a ransomware. 2017, we've got WannaCry and NotPetya. Now, I'm sure you guys probably heard a lot about those in the news. Those are kind of big deals. 2018, now this is not technically a ransomware, Triton here. But what Triton is it's a malware that we think is going to turn into a ransomware. Triton was specifically targeted at things like nuclear plants, industrial systems, water treatment plants, and they found code in there that could shut down the safety systems in those facilities. And you could think about where that could go with ransomware. Hey, if you don't give us the payment, we're going to hurt a lot of people. Moving forward to 2019 and what's next, a lot of more Internet of Things devices, and I'll touch that more at the end, future of ransomware. Okay, so who are the victims of ransomware? Well, these are all from this year. This is not like several years ago. The oldest one I think here is March. So Georgia police officers, they lost complete access to all of their files in the field because of a ransomware attack. Baltimore City of Maryland, they were crippled for over a month. In their case, it was an $18 million loss. Remember I talked about earlier, per incident could be $363,000. For them, it was much more crippling. Manufacturing, they got the Norsk Hydro aluminum manufacturing plant. They had to halt and switch back to manual process. And then healthcare IT security news said that about 320,000 patient records were inaccessible due to ransomware. You could think about that if you were in the middle of some sort of surgery and the doctor has to check your patient file to see what medications you're allergic to. That could be a problem if they can't access your patient file. So it kind of affects everybody. So what about these third parties that promise to go ahead and take care of it for you? Say, all right, you've been hit with ransomware. Don't worry. Just contact us. We'll take care of it for you. Well, actually, in many cases, ProPublica released this information. They found that a lot of these third parties, they just are going to go ahead and pay the ransom for you. And then they're going to give you a markup for their service, a fee. Say, hey, we paid that for you. Your data kind of came back. So in many cases, the customer was better off paying the ransomware directly rather than relying on third-party service. So just be aware of that. Not all, but definitely there's some evidence that some do that. Okay, so what kind of entry points? How are they getting into the system? Remember from that guide, the hackers try to get it onto the system first. So email, the biggest one, talks about email. Of course, URLs, anything you download, unsafe networks, if you go on a coffee shop network, Wi-Fi, kind of at your own risk. Social networking, mobile devices, and software vulnerabilities, right? Patches, make sure you're patched up to date. If software has a vulnerability, they can get in. Excuse me. Also, of course, instant message and peer-to-peer networking. Okay, and what kind of forms? The big thing to take away from this is that these are stuff we use every day. So ransomware could be in a JavaScript, VB script, Windows executable, Office application, PDF. It's just things that you would think are everyday documents. And they're actually, they could be ransomware. Okay, now I talked about WannaCry a little bit, and that's what the demo is going to deal with today. So I want to talk and show you a little bit how WannaCry spread. So it starts out, the reason why it was able to work on the system was due to a Microsoft exploit. They did patch it actually in time. The patch was out, but most people didn't have their patch system when they were hit by it. So that's how they got in with that vulnerability. It had an executable that would create a task. The task would actually create 2 files on the system. The WannaCry config file and the WannaCry actual file that kicks off the encryption process of the files. And at the end, you're going to end up with a .WannaCry extension on all your files. It encrypts both local and shared files, so anything it could find on the network. The vulnerability was, I said it was a Microsoft, it was specifically an SMB version 1 file sharing protocol, SMB. All right, and this is what it would look like when you were hit with it. You would see this big red screen. It would tell you, hey, you have this amount of time before the payment's going to go up. And then after that, if you still don't pay, this is how long you have before we go ahead and just your files, you're no longer able to access them. So it was a pretty massive global infection. Like I said, it was SMB version 1 vulnerability. The ransomware would double from 300 to 600 if you didn't pay in that certain amount of time. And it affected over 150 countries. There were 230,000 cases. Russia was definitely hit pretty hard, as well as the UK. So it was definitely a global event. All right, so, well, I mentioned earlier, hackers don't even have to be able to create the ransomware themselves. So this is out on the dark web. You can actually go out there and you can say, I don't know anything about ransomware, but I'm a bad guy and I want to start making money. So I'm just going to go to this dashboard on the dark web and download my ransomware so that I can start earning Bitcoin. They're able to get to that easily. They don't even have to be good at coding to do it. All right, so now that hopefully I've properly scared you about ransomware and given you a little bit of history, what can you do about it, right? Because obviously it sounds very bad out there. How can NetApp help? Well, there's 2 ways. So there is detection, prevention, but also remediation, okay? So there's two avenues. You don't want to get hit with ransomware, but if you do, then you want to know how you can quickly remediate and restore, but also if you can stop it in its tracks, that's even better with detection and prevention. Okay, so NetApp solution for ransomware, F-policy. F-policy is built into ONTAP. We're calling it our zero trust engine. In fact, we say take a zero trust approach to security. We have an entire session on that. My colleague Dan Tullidge is speaking about that one, so if you guys have time, check that out. But F-policy uses, it has 2 modes, and I'll get to it in more detail later what the modes are. But one of the things it can leverage is user behavioral analytics, and this is integrated with a third party. So you can see what typical file access looks like for a user, and then if they start taking weird behavior, like reading all the files they can get to and starting to write a lot of files, new files, that would be a flag to the user behavioral analytics and said, hey, something's going on here that's not typical, might want to shut that down. F-policy can also integrate with a SIM system, security information. Oops, let me back up, sorry about that. Security information event management integration. Sorry, just grab some water here. We also have something new that I'm not going to talk too much about, but NetApp Cloud Insights. There is a session on that as well. I actually thought it was on that slide, but it might be at the end slide. But NetApp Cloud Insights leverages something called NetApp Cloud Secure. And what that does is it's our own F-policy system. It can monitor file access for NetApp files. It also alerts on user behavioral changes. Most of the F-policy stuff that we integrate with is third-party vendors, but we do have Cloud Insights now. So let's say, though, if you don't have either one of those, and F-policy is built in, by the way, but the user behavioral analytics is not. You'd have to go with a third party with that part of it. Snapshots. If you don't have F-policy, you don't have that set up, you can actually see what's in a ransomware attack via snapshot changes, or also massive change in storage efficiencies. And I will touch on these more in the demo. All right, so a little bit more on F-policy. Like I said, there's 2 modes. The native mode, you specifically say, hey, I want to block these extensions, or it also has a file auditing component to it as well. But for ransomware, you say, hey, don't allow these particular extensions. Now, the external mode is where it will integrate with one of these different vendors here. These are all third-party partners, and that's where you're going to have your user behavioral analytics. And here's how it works with that scenario, external mode. So you have a CIFS or NFS client. They try to do a read or write. You're going to be able to ONTAP generates an F-policy event. Once it generates that event, it'll talk to the F-policy server. Based on what they're trying to do, the F-policy server will respond. At the same time, it'll send out a notification to your SIM system, and it'll send the response and said, hey, yeah, this is cool, or no, stop this. By the way, F-policy doesn't always do that. You can have it just log and more audit. You don't have to necessarily use it for this as well, but it's for ransomware, it's a great use case because it can detect those changes. And like I said, there's our Cloud Insights ones that we have. So real time. Okay, so remediation, when you think about how do you recover from ransomware, so that was more the detection and prevention side. And again, I'll show you more of the snapshot and storage efficiency features on that in the demo. But once ransomware is detected, really you want to do three things. You could almost consider them in this order. The only reason I vary from that, you don't necessarily have to do them in this order. You may have something you need to recover very quickly, very important. So you might jump right to this step, but if you do that, you're going to have to be a little careful because it's still in your environment. So if possible, try to do it this way. First, you want to contain it, okay, and basically isolate the client machines, whoever's infected, all the servers, disconnect them from the network, run your antivirus, anti-malware on those, run on-demand scans on your files, anywhere you got file storage, SMB share, SIF share, and prepare is the next step. So once you've done that, you want to figure out how did they get in, what software vulnerability, right? Once you find out the vulnerability, you want to patch those systems so you don't get hit with it again. Then once you do that, you should go ahead and recover. If you've got NetApp snapshots, it's pretty easy to recover, and I'll show you that. You want to store the data, obviously, from a clean backup. Because again, if you go ahead and just go with a restore, but you haven't disconnected those machines from the network, and you haven't done anything to patch them, then likely you're just going to get hit with it again.
And with that, I will turn it over back to Matt.
All right. Thank you, Matt. Great information about ransomware, great information about how we can protect ourselves. So I just want to wrap things up. In summary, EDUCAUSE, as you know, publishes an annual top 10 IT issues. In 2020, the #1 issue was information security strategy. And so on the EDUCAUSE website, it actually calls out a number of things that institutions should be doing, as part of their information security strategy. So a couple of those things, again, get an assessment of your maturity and threat landscape and prioritize with executive sponsorship an agreement on which top initiatives you're going to pursue. Another thing EDUCAUSE recommends is don't assume that you're doing it well. The best CISOs are always looking over their shoulder. Again, another recommendation is rinse and repeat. Repeat the maturity assessments. Don't just do one, whether it's an annual maturity assessment, semi-annual, biannual, the best information security strategy plans require some sort of regular assessments to security. And then finally, another recommendation is to use back-end tools that can help monitor the security, monitor compliance. And so, finally, NetApp can help with these things. NetApp has a data and protection security assessment where we can help institutions, higher ed institutions, take a look at their data and identify gaps and come up with a plan to remediate exposures. Another place where NetApp can help is we've got tools to help monitor the back-end security from protecting your data with automated and early detection on ransomware and other malware. We have tools that can help alert on misuse or theft of data by malicious actors. And we also have tools that can help ensure compliance, whether you've got HIPAA data or PCI or PII data. We can help ensure that you're compliant with your data sets, whether they're on-prem or in the cloud. And if you want to learn more in terms of how NetApp can help, reach out to your NetApp representative. Glad to help. But again, thank you today for your participation, and hopefully we learned something in terms about the landscape of ransomware in higher education and how we can protect ourselves against it. Again, thank you for attending.